I said technology, innovation, and therefore fintechs are means to bring financial services to the underserved and unserved population. This sparked a long discussion with the OCC, so long that we had to break into a few parts. In part 2 of this mini-series, we will discuss the future of fintechs. More often than not, I feel that I'm running, just to catch up with innovation and product development. In the wake of the scandals like Wirecard and the flaw in Revolut payment system reported, what can we do better in the fintechs from a governance, risk management, and compliance perspective?
I'm convinced that the majority of the technology which is being used across financial institutions of all sizes, all types, is unnecessarily complex. And I'm especially troubled that no matter what is delivered today is not the final product. As an industry, we are expected to basically develop the vendor's product for them. And I like the idea that the product arrives in a box and it does what it says. And that is absolutely not what's happening. And this is, I think, why so many compliance officers around the world are finding it such a challenge to deal with the technology, because the tech people are buying it because it's all nice and bright and shiny. They like it because they've got to spend more money on new computers. So when they go to get their next job, they're able to say, well, in my previous job, my technology spend was X millions. And so I expect to have a job bigger than that. When in fact, what we really need is to tell the tech companies to sort themselves out, deliver something that works, and stop changing it so that we can get used to it. That's not in their interests, but it is in the interest of the industry they claim to serve. Mark?
Well, yes, no, I'm afraid. I'm going to bow to Des and Julia as the resident fintech experts, and I'm going to play a little bit of as an old codger, I have seen some truly stupid implementations of technology in my life. And I'm going to break it into a couple of areas, if I may, briefly, Julia. I've seen clearing banks implement technology in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, when they said we have these brand new informational management systems, which were then 20 years old. And we don't need all that information you have in branch. So all the files were not transferred with all information, so that when I came to close my late mother's account and I asked them, how long was she banking with your great clearing organization? Oh, I've never been asked that question, Mark. Tappity tap, 25 years. They were only out by quarter of a century. So the big problem with a lot of fintech, garbage in, garbage out. I accept fully the premise that it's implemented badly, that it changes too rapidly. And then I'm going to look at the regulators and say, they expect the users of sophisticated, say, anti-money laundering systems to know the shortcomings and how these systems works. In other words, it's a big informational knowledge basis. Now, if you are an under-resourced compliance MLRO department, you spend all your time running around trying to understand what's going on, not at risk of not asking the basic questions. And in fintech in particular, which has been seen as a magic bullet for accessing those who are underbanked or not banked or don't have access to financial services, you immediately wander straight back into the basic questions that are so often badly or not asked at all: who, what, why, where, and so on. Indeed, we're back down to client identification again, and how you run that forward in not wealthy societies. So it's just a few bits for me to sort of sit on my hands and go, those are the problems I think I can see. But Des, am I being reasonable with that?
As usual, yes. You are being reasonable. For me, if we're kind of talking about fintech, first of all, let's get it clear that what we are calling fintech and the businesses that we know and love, whether Julia mentioned Revolut, and known companies. The reality is, within the fintech industry, I'm aware that I would suggest that in the UK and EU, there's probably about 80% of those fintechs are struggling financially. So when we kind of link this to governance and compliance, there's always that issue. Are you recruiting more people? What technology are you bringing in? And fintech, the sheer nature of what is now called fintech, which is supposed to be the answer to the great to stop just the banks working the way they are, and everybody's a lot more agile, which is a weird phrase anyway. For me, the problem that needs to be solved for many fintechs when it comes to third-party software or whatever is to get an overall holistic, or even for me, an understandable approach to the oversight of the activities that they're performing, especially bearing in mind that there's not necessarily a mutually trusted relationship between fintech firms and the financial regulators. And it takes time for the regulators all over the world to adapt and get used to the complexities of financial digitization, or whatever you want to call it, how we're trying to make things faster, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think on the tools, right? You are right. There now this terminology called RegTech is actually something very popular that they throw around, and they say that we have this AI-powered solution that is able to help you with your customer due diligence and your screening. Sometimes I wonder whether they really, when they develop these RegTech tools, whether or not they really know what we're looking for, or what the landscape looks like, because they don't most of the time are fit for purpose.
It's worse than that, I think, Julia. There is an illusion that if you gather data or gather news stories, that they are actually news. And I don't think that they have worked out that what was acceptable news policy 20 years ago is now no longer what news organizations do. It's all about the clicks, it's all about the clickbait, and therefore they gather huge amounts of information. We can use the Nigel Farage case as an example of that, most of which is complete drivel. And then apparently, as long as you fill the bucket for the risk assessment with this drivel, you've done your job. And the short answer is, no, you goddamn haven't. And this is part of the issue. They are selling solutions, which I think you're alluding to, based on a misunderstanding, either willful or accidental, as to what the hell the role of an MLRO is. Nigel?
Can I go back 25 years? The term financial technology related to the technology that was in use in banks. And we have to remember that the military, pornography, and banking have always been at the forefront of technological development. So you can go back 50 years and find the banks using technology that was advanced compared to the rest of the world. So here's where we have a definitions problem. Financial technology 25 years ago, as slang, was known as fintech. It did not mean a company providing financial services by an alternative licensing system. So because I'm old, I talk about fintech not as the companies that are doing the stuff. I talk about fintech as being the technology that the banks and the quote fintech companies are buying in order to deliver their services. So there is a difference between fintech and a fintech, which is utterly confusing, but there is. So when Julia says we have a problem with fintech, I think she's talking about the technology which is being delivered to banks, insurance companies, everybody else, and quote a fintech. And the quality of that technology which is being delivered is inadequate. And it's not only inadequate, but it's incomplete. And that's what I mean when I say that the product is growing up in public. Companies like HugoSave, well, actually I can't say that because I don't know what HugoSave uses, but companies of that type are, and banks are being given product, and the vendors are coming in and saying, it will do this if you help us make it do it. Well, how is that helpful?
Yeah, there are two parts to this question, really, and that means that we are going to have part 3 to discuss more about the RegTech and what we have. I think, in general, it would be the feeling that I get is that because of technology, a lot of times I feel like tools aside, I don't have sufficient knowledge to be able to manage the risk of that new product as well as I wish I could, much less if we are using tick box exercise in most instances. Mark, you put your hand up, and rest too. So this is a new way of not talking over each other.
Very, very briefly, I think Nigel raised a fantastic point, because when I think of fintech today, it sounds as if, or to my mind, I automatically go to modern companies raising capital to address an area of need or perceived need. But I think Nigel raises a fantastic point about that. In terms of relating to what Julia has just said, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a bit of a military history buff. And turns out that during the American Civil War, the North used a new form of heavy slug and rifle called the Minié ball. And it was deemed to have won the war. Modern research would seem to indicate that it did have an impact, but people were so badly trained in its use that they used it like an old-fashioned musket and still won. And I have a feeling that modern compliance officers and money laundering reporting officers are waging a constant struggle, sometimes against the very technology that is there to help them, and are still doing a reasonable job. But you're then coming back to being dependent on the people rather than the systems. Des.
Definitely, Nigel and yourself have hit upon something, and what I'd really like to back that up to a certain extent is that the fact that what's become evident nowadays is that a big challenge is trust, not technology, or it's trust within the technology, because everybody's talking about the data that fintechs are picking up and how they're using it and what they're doing with it. And the third-party software is often there's so many companies out there offering whether it's an onboarding piece, or whether it's the PEP and sanctions check-in or the adverse media check-in. What isn't looked at too deeply is that a lot of them go back to maybe only 1 or 2 major ones, which would be the old world check, which is now Refinitiv, or a couple of others that are the large bank ones. And we all know, and that's another conversation, that the issue is how often is that data updated, swept, cleaned up? How once you're on it, is there a way to get off of some of these things? So I would state it again, it's trust within the technology that we have to have. And for all of us here, and Julia, to answer your question, I think it's understanding what it does, but also understanding what it doesn't do.
I would draw yet another distinction within the financial technology arena, which is that we have what I like to call RegTech, because I always think of it as being an old Yorkshireman with a flat cap. Reg tech makes sense. We have the processing technology, which is what the fintech companies are trying to sell us as their product. But then we also have the back end, which is the actual straightforward account processing material. And that should be at the heart of everything. Everything should be hanging off that. But at the moment, what I see is the fintech technology for delivering the product itself, and the RegTech are all being developed independently. And the integration of those with the actual core thing, I go back to what I've said previously, that banks have one job, which is to make money for their shareholders, and as a byproduct, to make money for their customers. We're not dealing with the core business. We're focusing on all these other things outside that, which are costing a fortune. They are utterly disruptive, and not in the way that the trendy people use the term. They militate against the effectiveness of the organization, whilst being sold as something which is going to enhance the efficiency, lower the costs, and everything else. And then you get that it all focuses, the pointy end, the tip of the spear, so to speak, is pointing straight at Julia's forehead. This is not
absolutely. Well, no, it isn't how it should be. But then you get even worse. You get, as we get to about 15 minutes so far, you get to the point where professional advisors, and yes, I'm looking at you, the big four accountants, are going, oh, that compliance function's terribly expensive. We can automate that. Yeah. From people who professionally, in all the four major firms, having had problems with their ethics exams in the last 18 months. Telling banks and fintechs, go for it in a sec, Des, telling banks and fintechs, this is the way we can save you some money. And by the way, Nigel, I admire your description of banking and its central IT functions. I believe it's much more it's much less robust than you think it is, particularly the back end, dependent on very, very old processing systems.
No, I'm not suggesting it's not robust. It isn't. We know that. We know that the old systems are creaky, and we know that nobody took what I was telling the industry to do 20 years ago, which is to combine all of their various different systems that don't talk to each other into one giant system running on one simple common database and using XML to extract the data. Simple, cheap, really against the interests of the very consultants you've just been talking about and the hardware and software companies which have convinced the banks that they can only operate if they have proprietary formats.
I think
Yes.
We're out of time.
No, we still have time. Yes.
We have -1 minute.
oh dear.
We should explain.
Go for it,
First, we've had a number of technological problems in various places. We don't understand them. Things that were working 15 minutes before we went on air or started recording are no longer working. And that's been the case for two of us. My camera was working perfectly and then just died, which is why I'm invisible. But as Des says, I have a great face for radio, so it's fine. We've also had various squirrely noises in the background, and we don't know why that's happening. We're trying to make it so that we fit within 15 minutes, and we failed. So that's why we're all having a giggle, because all of our human technology is being tricked by actual technology, which isn't doing as it should be doing. So sorry,
tech companies are out to get us because we've been critical of them. Des, please bring us to a professional end.
I'm unable to do that. I'm sorry. I really am. If you want professional, you're asking the wrong person. Sorry. Thank you, Julia, for the time.
Thank you, Julia.
I think we can end on another time.
Okay.
Oh, I think I can conclude with that. While fintechs are not building the products that are okay, never mind.
What
Okay.
you're trying to say is the products are not robust. The products that fintech companies are building is not robust. The problem that the companies are building the technology to sell to the fintech companies is not robust. And the back-end technology should be robust, but it isn't. But in any case, we're not building the product around it, which is what we should be doing. Is that right?
Many of the compliance and risk departments are not robust enough to be able to handle it, definitely.
Well,
Thank you, Des. Absolutely right.
I
And in the words of the great
will-
Arnold Schwarzenegger, we'll be back. Julia, over to you.
You guys nailed it. That was a good conclusion. Thank you. Over and out.